Hello everybody, welcome back to another Conversations with Projektor. This one is going to be a little bit different as we only have one topic today. We are going to talk about the directionality of sound. Now I spent a little bit of extra time on the editing for this one, so I hope you enjoy it.
Sure, but too much bass in an untamed, untreated room can cause more room issues.
What do you mean cause more room problems? When it comes to the issues of like room issues, what they mean is that there's the speaker doesn't only go to your head, right? With the sound that is coming out. It goes into the room as well, and it starts reflecting on the walls. That's why studios spend so much money on proper treatment, so those reflections don't cause any issues. You're not hearing the reflections anymore. You basically want to only hear the speakers and not the sound bouncing off the walls, bouncing off the back, bouncing off the wall over that side. You don't want any of that. Because lower frequencies are more omnidirectional. That's not entirely true. They carry out more. Means that it takes more energy for them to go to a lower volume. Or technically not. It's just that their wavelength is longer. So it takes more space for them to go to a lower volume. They decay at the same rate. But because higher frequencies are faster. It's air moving very, very fast. It say that it takes like 20 cycles for a certain volume to stop completely, right? Then the high frequencies will stop in this amount of time because the cycle is very short. And then with bass frequencies, the cycle being so long, it will reflect a bunch of times in your room before it loses that power, it loses that energy. That's why bass frequencies tend to be bigger problems. Hence why I said more omnidirectional. But omnidirectional would mean that they go in more directions. It's not the case that higher frequencies only travel in one direction and the lower frequencies go in all directions. Which, according to science, is actually very true. I've never heard that. I've never heard higher frequencies have a harder time traveling in multiple directions. What I've heard is that they just fade out quicker because their wave cycle is shorter. In fact, it would be very strange because that would mean that if you were to go off axis from the speaker, you suddenly don't hear the high frequencies anymore. It's not the case that I move back here and I stand up over here, for example, and now I don't hear my hi-hat. That just does not happen. The frequencies, the high frequencies go into all directions. Even if I move behind my speakers, I can still hear my hi-hats. There are countless of articles on this. I mean, if you can show me an article, I don't think you guys can link in my chat, but maybe in my Discord, if you show me an article, that would be interesting. Because I've never heard of this. If you want, you can drop it right here in stream discussion of or conversation topics.
Copy-paste, but as the frequency gets lower, the sound becomes less directional and harder to pinpoint. Get down to the bass frequencies below about 80 Hz, for example a bass guitar or bass drum, and the sound is no longer directional. In fact, it is omnidirectional, meaning it appears to emanate from everywhere.
Yes, Guido, you're talking about perception now. You're not talking about generation. We were talking about sound generation coming from the speakers, but you're talking about the human perception of sound. That is true, because bass frequencies move your body, you don't hear them, so you cannot pinpoint a direction. But that has everything to do with the human psyche and nothing to do with how sound actually works physically.
The hard part about low versus high in a room is not the directionality. It's because as rooms get bigger, low pressure frequencies pressurize the room. This creates standing waves.
Yeah, the issue is going to be standing waves creating resonances, so boosting certain frequencies with respect to others because their wavelength perfectly fits within one direction of the room. So from one wall to another. That creates the standing waves. That's an issue. But that has nothing to do with directionality, because the directionality that Guido is talking about solely has to do with somebody hearing it. And the things that we are talking about of how sound functions in a room is independent of if there's a human present to listen to it.
Well, I am reading that it's also a physical reality. Looking for proper articles to send. I know what you mean about our human perception and ability to pinpoint where it comes from, but that's not what I'm referring to.
It does seem that way with the way that the copy-paste is written before.
I think that low frequencies do spread spherically and higher frequencies spread cylindrically. At least that's what I've read somewhere.
I don't think so. I don't think that there's a difference in terms of frequency spreading differently on higher frequencies, or that there's a different spread between the higher frequencies. Because if you really boil it down, what a frequency is just like a strength of a vibration. And at the end of the day, the way that sound transfers through a medium is that one atom starts to vibrate, and then the next atom starts to vibrate as well, and then the next atom starts to vibrate as well. I don't think that the speed of which the atom vibrates makes it so that different atoms start to vibrate. It should just all spread in the same way. They both spread the same way, they are just longer versus shorter waves. Yeah, what could happen is, say for example, I'm talking into the microphone and now I start talking away from the microphone. What that does, I guess, for the human mouth, it is a bit directional because you're pushing it through a tube. So you're already kind of giving a direction to the vibration, like forward, right? If you blow through a tube, the wind is going to go one way, but if it's unbound, then I don't think that there's like any difference in the way that sounds travel. But what could happen is if I move away from the microphone, you hear less higher frequencies because higher frequencies decay faster. So it takes a longer distance from the source to the microphone to be able to pick up. And therefore, because that distance becomes bigger, the higher frequencies start to decay more and more in between that they leave my mouth and that they get picked up by the microphone. And therefore, you get less higher frequencies because they just decay faster.
Maybe this makes sense. All waves tend to spread out at the edge when they pass through a gap or past an object. For spreading to happen, the wave must be larger than the object. High-frequency waves have high directivity and can easily be blocked, whereas low frequencies have low directivity and spread far and wide.
I don't even know what you're saying, to be honest. Let's stick with the basic idea that sounds exist in a vacuum and that there's no objects and no perception and anything like that. Because the human perception plays a role in that. The positioning of any objects has to play a role in that. We can start off with the basic assumption that all sound is just atoms vibrating against each other. What happens with, for example, a standing wave is that those vibrations happen to align with the length of the room. In that, how would you translate that into the vibration of one thing? I guess the kind of like Newton's, those balls, Newton's cradle, I think it's called, the balls that you have, where if the ball falls on the left side, then the ball goes back up on the right side, and you have those 5 little metal balls that bounce back and forth. You know what I mean? That's what's happening in the air as well, with the atoms that are vibrating. I don't see any reason why an object being placed in that would change that. Because I'm trying to figure out what that would mean in a practical sense as well. And that would mean that if I were to take like a tube and talk into that the highest frequencies wouldn't come out, that you wouldn't be able to hear the higher frequencies. I don't think that's the case.
Diffraction is the bending of waves around small objects and the spreading out of a wave through small openings.
I think diffraction doesn't that have to do with quantum physics? Isn't that the double slit experiment, for example? Because then it would be at a much smaller amount than sound would be, I assume. Oh, it does take place with sound.
Diffraction, the spreading of waves around obstacles. Diffraction takes place with sound, with electromagnetic radiation, such as light, X-rays, and gamma rays, and with very small moving particles such as atoms, neutrons, and electrons, which show wave-like properties.
It's dependent on the size of the gap. It's hard to say how big of an issue this, or how small of a gap it has to be, because if we're talking about like this big of a gap, like a few microsections,
What?
or micrometers or whatever, like a very, very small gap on the level of quantum physics, then it's not going to impact anything practical. It's not going to impact the way that your speakers are positioned, which is where this discussion started. Also, nobody has a slit like this in their room between their speakers and their like ears.
Some dude says, lower frequency waves have higher wavelengths. When a wave passes through an opening whose width is much larger than the wavelength, the wave passes straight through. However, when the opening is smaller than the wavelength, the sound wave diffracts, sending the low frequency tone in all directions.
I get what you're saying, Guido, but that doesn't mean that in general lower frequency waves are more directional than higher frequency waves. Your initial statement was that higher frequencies are less directional than lower frequencies, which would essentially mean that there would be, for example, position in the room because of the way that the speakers are positioned and the way that they're outputting their sound, that you would have parts of your room where you could only hear the low frequencies. That might be true because of other things, because of acoustics and something like that, but not because of the directionality of sound. Like it will never, I don't think it will ever be the case that you can stand somewhere in the room and just not hear the hi-hats, but hear the rest of the track, because the hi-hats are only high frequencies.
Let's say if you'd placed the monitors in an open fields without any objects, then it probably wouldn't be relevant.
Even in a closed room, it's not relevant because there's nothing in between the monitors and your face for the sound to deflect, whatever the thing was that you talked about before.
It's more like the lower you go, the more omnidirectional they become. But that's just what I've learned, which doesn't mean it's accurate.
It depends on what you mean with omnidirectionality, Greedo. I don't know what you exactly mean with omnidirectionality. Omnidirectional, I think, just means less directional. Yes, but exactly how, right? Because we've talked about this situation in terms of monitors. We've talked about situations in terms of generation. We've talked about this in terms of perception. Because in perception, I can see that. I can see that bass frequencies are harder to identify where they're coming from than higher frequencies, because you can hear higher frequencies, but you can only feel bass frequencies. But if you say they are omnidirectional, in what sense do you mean?
Fair enough. I also don't know. You're a bit more technical than I am. I'm just trying to translate what I've been taught, but like I said, this teaching might be based on a misconception, and just maybe that misconception stems from the fact we humans have a harder time to pinpoint the direction of lower frequencies.
Yeah, I'm not saying that I know. I'm just saying that from my experience, it doesn't sound likely that lower frequencies, for some reason, for some physical reason, have that more, like, are able to move around corners more or anything like that. Like if your mother yells from downstairs, those are pretty much no bass frequencies, but you can still hear it, even though it's moving from the kitchen through the living room, up the stairs, through the hallway, into your room. You still hear that. So and I don't know. It's not like it sounds muffled, with respect to like just standing next to her for something like that. Like I'm trying to link this idea of directionality to something that I know physically, right? That I've experience with. And I think the thing that you're confused with is just the fact that higher frequencies in general tend to spread out less from a point source. From like if you had a point in space and their sound would start to generate, the high frequencies would travel less distance before you cannot hear them than the low frequencies. But that doesn't mean that low frequencies go in more directions. They both go in all directions. The low frequencies just go further. Well, it would mean that all these articles are confusing it. I don't know. I would need to look into it. I would need to see all of the articles. Again, I would invite you to send them here or here, something like that. I could make a topic of that. We could discuss this in here if you have any articles that we want to listen to or that we want to look at.
By the way, for anybody still watching, if you want to contribute to this video series, you can also suggest topics in the same channel on my Discord server.
Post it in the stream discussion. Let's have a look at this article and...
The audio blog, Why High Frequencies Are Directional and Low Aren't. When discussing good sounding rooms, I wrote about reflections and mentioned that low frequencies are omnidirectional while highs are directional, and as a consequence, it's easier to absorb the latter than the former, for the simple reasons that you can tell where they end up on the wall. In other terms, low frequencies are spherical looking down from the ceiling. You would draw them as circles emitting from the source. While high frequencies are planar, i.e. looking down from the ceiling, you would see them as parallel lines emitting from the source.
I would like to see these diagrams drawn out because I don't know what they are interpreting. Like even, so this, not to kill the messenger, but it is if I were to present something like this at the university that I would study, the professors would say like, this is way too vague with what you're saying. What kind of source? How, like, you would at least have one diagram in here, and you would need to explain what kind of source there are. You would also need to define what you mean with high and low, right? Because I'm assuming that there's some kind of crossover happening between the spherical properties of the low frequencies and the planar properties of the high frequencies. So where would that crossover be? How steep is that crossover? All of that you would need to kind of know before you can make a proper conclusion from that. Because if I see the word source, I immediately assume point source, right? Which is just, if this is a room, you just make the smallest possible point that you can make. Boop, like that. You guys cannot even see that. I'll make it a little bit bigger just for you guys to see. And this represents the speaker in any diagram, right? And the reason why they do that is because that simplifies some of the calculations that you have to make. You don't have to take into account the physical disk width, for example, but you can all concentrate that on one single point in space. So when I see the word source, I automatically go to point source, which means that by definition, you cannot have parallel lines emitting from that. So it's really hard to understand these very technical things because often they lack the technical terms that really explain it well enough to understand, that give you enough detail to make the picture in your mind. First off, I lied, all sound waves are spherical. Okay, I should have read more.
What allows us to think of some as spherical and some other as planar is the relationship between the size of the room we're in and the source, with respect to the wavelength of the frequency we're looking at. It's simple to understand using an analogy we all are familiar with, planet Earth. Now, unless you are part of questionable circles or have grown up in some jungle in Papua New Guinea, it should be fairly clear to you that the Earth is a sphere. And yet when you walk a road, it feels perfectly flat. You have absolutely no sense of curvature. Why? Simple, Earth's is immense with respect to the distance you are walking your size. In particular, Earth's diameter on the equator is about 12.000 kilometers, 7,457 miles. Way longer than the say 30 kilometers, 18 miles that a trained walker can make in a day. So from the perspective of your size, Earth curvature is about 12.5 centimeters every 1 kilometer. At the meter scale, where we live, that's about 0.0125 centimeters every meter. That is a tenth of a micrometer per meter, where a hair's width is about 17 to 180 micrometers, that is to say 100 times higher.
So in here, they're just explaining that it's a problem of scale, right? We don't see the Earth as round because the length that you have to go away to go down a certain amount is way more than you can experience in any normal amount of time. If you were to start walking, you would essentially start walking on the curve, but it looks straight to us because for the length that you're walking in, say, a day, you only go down a very small amount. And actually, the reason why we don't experience curvature has not so much to do with the amount of going down versus the amount of going further away on the Earth, but it's the fact that by moving, your position relative to the center of mass changes, which technically is a little bit different here because this assumes what do you call it? Stationary point of reference. Well, if you're walking around the Earth, you don't have a stationary point of reference because your point of reference moves along with you. That being said, let's continue. You can perceive the physical, the curvature is imperceptible. Yeah, this is essentially what they mean. Because the physical world, the Earth is so big and the curvature is so minimal, we don't actually perceive it.
The same happens with sound waves. A room is usually a volume at the single meter scale or 10 feet scale. Sources are a loudspeaker or a mouth or something at that scale. High-frequency sound waves are high-frequency because they repeat many times in 1 second. A 10 kHz waves repeats 10,000 times in a second. Since sound speed is 343 ms at room temperature, that means that each air oscillation is very short, 0.1126 feet or 0.03432 meters.
Okay. 3 centimeters for 10 kilohertz. This is 10 kilohertz. That is bigger than I thought it would be. But then again, like low frequencies, I know like 50 hertz is 14 meters or something like that. So there is a big difference in scale there.
The scale of the wave is so much smaller than the scale of the room and the source that, exactly as for our human scale with the scale of Earth, we can consider it flat and hence directional.
Aha. This is where it becomes interesting. I think I understand what they mean. When they say directional, I think what they mean is not that the sound has a preference in terms of direction that it spreads out in that, say that you have a speaker comb over here that is producing sound. It's not like it is directional in that it wants to go this direction or does not want to go here, right? That it does not want to go there. Something like that is not the case. I think what they mean is that if you were observing the speaker head on, so this is the speaker comb, and this is the center of the speaker comb, the little dot that sits in the center. High frequencies come to you flat as a plane. So out of one direction as parallel lines towards you, whereas lower frequencies come from all over the place. Because they have time to reflect a bunch of times. I think that is the point that they're saying. And I think that this again shows how important it is to define your terms, because I thought that with directionality and omnidirectionality, especially because the word omni, it means all directions, right? Like there's a preference for one direction if you're not omnidirectional. That's how I interpreted it, but I don't think that that's what they're trying to say. I think what they're trying to say is, given a sound wave, if it's high frequency, you can think of it as a plane moving to you, a flat surface moving to you, which is that surface of sound. Whereas for low frequencies, because there are standing waves and all kinds of acoustic problems, you cannot really think of it that way. Yes, essentially because low frequencies have longer wavelengths. They have more time to interact with the wall. And I think that has to do with the property that because they have longer wavelengths, they take longer space to decay, right? Because a high frequency, say that it takes 3 oscillations to decay, it will look something like this, and a low frequency will look something like this. So there's just more space for it to go from the high peak to silence. From the high peak to silence. Right? If you play them both frequencies at the same volume, the lower frequency will travel for longer, and therefore it can create more standing waves, it can interact more with the acoustics of the room, and therefore it seems omnidirectional. Yeah, I fundamentally disagree with the article right off the bat. I liked it. They did indeed trick us into reading further. Right here. It's the image is positioned tactically. I stopped reading here and I started analyzing everything as well. I should have just continued reading. It's indeed very, very interesting. I like this kind of stuff. I like learning this kind of stuff. The only reason why I like learning this kind of stuff is because I would like to know how it makes my music better. And that is what was missing from university. We learned everything regarding this. I probably would have come across this if I went into the acoustic field instead of the musical engineering. Because there was 2 sides of it. There was musical engineering and acoustics engineering. If I had done acoustic engineering, I would have for sure known exactly what this was talking about. But this is very interesting. I was going to say I'm going to read this further, but it seems that there's not much more to read to it. I think I get what they are trying to say here. It's not directionality in that the sound has a preference to travel, but it's a directionality in that you can think of a high frequency. If you're sitting in one space in the room and the speaker is another space in the room, from your perspective, it's feeling like all of the high frequencies come from that speaker, whereas the low frequencies kind of come from everywhere. So I can safely say it now, or will you still kill me? I will hire a hitman. Yes. No, it's true. But it's only true in a perceptual way, I think. It isn't true in a physical way, in that all sound waves are spherical. But in a room, with normal proportions, like they are explaining here, you can approximate it like that, essentially. You can just kind of say like, okay, we don't have to care about the higher frequencies because The higher frequencies are only going to come directly from the speaker because they are directional. We can safely say that it's likely to be harder to treat and tame. The lower frequencies, yes. Because they have more standing waves and all of that stuff.
So this is going to be it for now. I hope that you enjoyed this one. If you want to support the channel, make sure you check out some more of my videos. There will be 2 up in the cards right now, so just choose one and enjoy. But that's going to be it. I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.